The night is moonless over the trenches near Bathlément, France. It is November 2nd, 1917. The men of Company F, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, are green. Most have never heard a shot fired in anger. They huddle in shallow trenches, their rifles cold in their hands, their breath visible in the autumn air. They have been in France for only weeks. The war that has consumed Europe for 3 years is for them still an abstraction. Then the Germans come. The raid is swift, professional, brutal. German stormtroopers materialize from the darkness, veterans of 100 such operations. They know exactly where the American positions are. They know these boys are untested. When the firing stops, 3 Americans lie dead. 11 more stand with their hands raised, surrounded by enemy soldiers. Among them is Sergeant Edgar Halyburton of Stony Point, North Carolina, a career soldier who had chased Pancho Villa across the Mexican desert just a year before. Beside him stands Private Clyde Grimsley, a Kansas cornetist who had begged for a transfer from the band to the infantry because he wanted to see action. They are about to see more than they ever imagined. The Germans photograph their captives before marching them away. It is standard procedure, useful for propaganda. Show the American people their boys in enemy hands. Demoralize the fresh troops pouring into France. Prove that the Kaiser's army remains invincible. But something goes wrong with the propaganda. In one photograph, Sergeant Halyburton stares directly into the camera. His hand rests casually in his pocket. His other fist is clenched at his side. His jaw is set. His eyes burn with defiance. Within days, Allied intelligence seizes the image. They broadcast it across the world. American sculptor Cyrus Dallin sees it and is so moved that he casts Halyburton in bronze, a monument to resistance. Germany had captured these men to break American morale. Instead, they had created a symbol of American defiance. But the photograph told only part of the story. The camera could not capture what awaited Halyburton and Grimsley in the months ahead. The starvation, the forced labor, the disease, the propaganda war for their very souls. This is the story of America's forgotten prisoners, the 4,000 men who disappeared behind German wire in the Great War, the escapes, the resistance, the survival against impossible odds. These are the stories Germany didn't want told. To understand the American prisoner of war experience in the First World War, we must first understand how thoroughly unprepared America was for this reality. When Congress declared war on Germany in April 1917, the United States possessed no framework for dealing with captured soldiers. There was no training on conduct after capture, no established communication channels with enemy prison camps, no system for tracking missing men. The very concept of American soldiers languishing in foreign prisons seemed almost unimaginable to a nation that had not fought a major overseas war since the Spanish-American conflict nearly 2 decades earlier. The numbers, when they finally came, would tell a story of remarkable fortune compared to European allies. Approximately 4,120 American soldiers, sailors, and airmen would fall into German hands during the war. Another 240 merchant mariners would be captured at sea by U-boats and surface raiders. In the calculus of the Great War, where millions perished and hundreds of thousands were captured, these figures seem almost modest. But for the men who lived it, statistics offered no comfort. The first American to become a prisoner of war was not even wearing an American uniform. Russell A. Kelly of New York, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, had joined the French Foreign Legion in 1914, unable to wait for his own country to enter the fight. On June 17, 1915, during fighting near Artois, Kelly fell with what witnesses described as a ghastly wound. The Germans captured him and amputated his leg. He never saw home again. He died in captivity, his sacrifice largely forgotten, his name absent from most histories of American involvement in the war. Kelly's capture occurred 3 months before James Bark, a pilot flying for the French Air Service, who is often credited as the first American prisoner. The distinction matters less than the pattern it reveals. Americans were being captured and held long before their government acknowledged the war as their own. By the time the United States officially entered the conflict, a small but significant number of Americans already knew German captivity firsthand. 8 had been seized while serving in the French Foreign Legion. 16 had fallen while flying with the Lafayette Flying Corps, including the famed Lafayette Escadrille. Others had enlisted with British and Canadian forces, their American citizenship no protection against the fortunes of war. These men represented something new and troubling. They were, in effect, test cases for a system that had never contemplated their existence. The American government's eyes and ears in Germany before April 1917 belonged to Ambassador James W. Gerard, a former New York Supreme Court justice appointed by President Wilson in 1913. Gerard found himself thrust into an impossible position. As a neutral diplomat, he was responsible for protecting the interests of Britain, France, and other allied nations whose own ambassadors had fled Berlin at the war's outbreak. This meant, among other duties, inspecting prisoner-of-war camps and advocating for humane treatment. What Gerard witnessed appalled him. He documented his findings in a book published in 1917 titled My 4 Years in Germany. The work became a sensation, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and shaping American perception of German brutality. Gerard described camps where prisoners lived in squalor, where rations barely sustained life, where disease spread unchecked through overcrowded barracks. He wrote of his battles with German military bureaucracy, of corps commanders who wielded dictatorial power within their districts and answered to no civilian authority. The instances of mistreatment, Gerard wrote, were too numerous, the evidence too overwhelming to be denied. He took his complaints directly to Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. The Chancellor's response haunted Gerard for the rest of his life. Bethmann-Hollweg admitted he did not approve of how prisoners were treated, but he confessed he was powerless where the military was concerned. He referred Gerard to Bismarck's memoirs, as if the Iron Chancellor's ghost could explain why starving men in wire enclosures fell outside civilian control. This was the system awaiting American prisoners, a system of nearly 300 camps scattered across Germany and occupied territories, a system holding over 2 million men by 1918, a system where treatment varied wildly from camp to camp, dependent entirely on the character of individual commandants. For Halyburton, Grimsley, and the thousands who would follow them through the wire, the lottery of captivity was about to begin. The German prisoner-of-war system was not designed for cruelty. It was designed for efficiency. That these two qualities often became indistinguishable was a tragedy which the men behind the wire understood intimately. Germany had divided itself into 24 military districts, each functioning as an army corps region. Every district commander served as military governor of his territory, wielding near absolute authority over civilian and military matters alike once war was declared. These commanders did not report to the War Ministry in Berlin in any meaningful sense. They were, within their domains, autonomous powers unto themselves. This meant that prisoner treatment varied dramatically, depending on where the fortunes of war deposited you. A man captured in one sector might find himself in a camp run by a commandant who believed in strict adherence to the Hague Conventions. Another, seized in the same battle but processed through different channels, might land in a camp where brutality was policy and starvation a management technique. By October 1918, Germany held approximately 2.4 million prisoners of war. The camps designed to hold them were cities of the damned, sprawling complexes where men of a dozen nations lived in forced proximity. French and Russian prisoners predominated, but the barracks also held British, Canadian, Belgian, Italian, Romanian, Serbian, Portuguese, Japanese, and eventually American captives. The official regulations specified that each prisoner was entitled to 2.5 square meters of living space. In practice, men were packed into wooden barracks covered with tar, structures 50 meters long and 10 meters wide, each holding an average of 250 prisoners. The mathematics of misery worked out to significantly less space than regulations promised. Sanitation presented challenges that regulations could not address. Many camps featured only a single faucet in the yard for thousands of men. Latrines consisted of boards with holes positioned over open pits, which prisoners themselves were required to empty at regular intervals. When heavy rains came, the primitive toilets overflowed, spreading filth across clay soil that transformed into impassable mud. The stench, survivors recalled, became a permanent feature of existence. Disease followed inevitably. Typhus appeared in the early camps, spread by the lice that infested every prisoner. Cholera struck where water supplies became contaminated. The close confinement, the hundreds of men breathing the same stale air in each barrack, created ideal conditions for epidemic. But the cruelest factor was one Germany could not entirely control: the Allied naval blockade. Designed to strangle German military capacity, also strangled German civilians. By 1917, Germany was experiencing severe food shortages. The winter of 1916 to 1917 became known as the turnip winter, when that humble root vegetable became the primary sustenance for millions. Bread was rationed, meat became a memory. Butter and lard vanished entirely from common tables. Prisoners, as a matter of policy, received even less than civilians. The Hague Conventions specified that captives should receive rations equivalent to the troops of the capturing power. When those troops themselves were hungry, prisoners starved. The American Red Cross began delivering food parcels to American prisoners in November 1917, immediately after the first captures. These packages contained meat, fish, vegetables, bread, fruit, and 80 cigarettes, rotated on a weekly schedule to provide variety. For American prisoners, these parcels meant the difference between survival and slow starvation. But in the early months, delivery was uncertain. Halyburton sent desperate postcards to the Red Cross from Tuchel, begging for assistance. 4 months passed before the first parcels arrived. 4 months of hunger. 4 months of watching men weaken and die. This was the system. Efficient, bureaucratic, deadly. After their capture at Bathlément, Halyburton and Grimsley began a journey that would take them deep into the German prison system. They spent 30 days at Metz in German-occupied France before being transported east to Tuchel prison camp in West Prussia. Tuchel was among the largest camps in the German system, one of the facilities designed to process and hold tens of thousands of prisoners. For the Americans, it represented their first extended experience of captivity. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The conditions at Tuchel were, in the restrained language of official reports, harrowing. The camp sat in a region of harsh winters, and the prisoners arrived with inadequate clothing for the climate. Food was scarce even by the diminished standards of German prison camps. The guards, many of them older men or wounded soldiers returned from the front, maintained discipline through threat and occasional violence. But it was the labor that broke men. Halyburton and his fellow Americans were forced into heavy work details. Their primary task was harvesting lumber from the surrounding forests, felling trees and processing timber for the German war effort. This alone was exhausting work, especially for men weakened by inadequate nutrition. But the labor did not end with the cutting. The prisoners were required to cart the wood back to camp. Miles of trudging through snow and mud, hauling loads that would have taxed well-fed men, performed by prisoners subsisting on watery soup and black bread that crumbled like sawdust. Grimsley, the Kansas musician who had traded his cornet for a rifle, fell ill within 3 months. Tonsillitis developed into bronchitis. He was admitted to the camp hospital, such as it was, and spent 5 weeks recovering. When he emerged, he took on the role of orderly, assisting 2 American doctors who had also been captured. It was lighter duty than the lumber details, and it likely saved his life. But not all were so fortunate. Grimsley later recalled playing his cornet at the funeral of an American prisoner, a man whose name history has not preserved. The music echoed across the camp, a fragment of home in a place designed to strip men of everything familiar. Halyburton, meanwhile, fought for survival through organization. He immediately began working to improve conditions, not through confrontation with the guards, but through the established channels of prisoner welfare. He sent postcards to the Red Cross, carefully worded requests for food parcels that he knew would be read by German censors. He advocated for his fellow prisoners, attempting to establish some framework of order in the chaos of captivity. The strategy worked, though slowly. 4 months after his first requests, Red Cross parcels finally began arriving at Tuchel. The packages contained food that seemed almost miraculous to men who had been living on German prison rations: canned meat, vegetables, bread that actually tasted like bread. For many prisoners, those parcels meant survival. After 7 months at Tuchel, Halyburton was transferred to Rastatt prison camp in Baden, in southwestern Germany. The move would transform him from a prisoner merely surviving into a leader of resistance. The German military understood that prisoners of war represented more than a logistical burden. They were a resource. Their labor could support the war effort. Their information could provide intelligence, and their loyalty, if properly manipulated, could be turned against their own nations. From the moment of capture, American prisoners faced systematic attempts to extract military intelligence. German interrogators employed sophisticated techniques, alternating between threat and kindness, isolation and false camaraderie. They probed for details about unit strengths, deployment schedules, morale among American troops, and the capabilities of American equipment. Most prisoners revealed little of value. They had been trained to provide only name, rank, and serial number, though the training was often cursory. More importantly, most enlisted men and junior officers simply did not possess information worth extracting. The German intelligence apparatus devoted considerable resources to learning things that prisoners genuinely did not know. But the propaganda campaign was different. Here the Germans saw an opportunity that extended far beyond military intelligence. The goal was to demoralize American prisoners so thoroughly that they would become useless as soldiers even if released. More ambitiously, German propagandists hoped to turn some prisoners into active collaborators who might spread defeatist sentiment among their fellow captives, or upon release among American troops and civilians. The methods were varied. Prisoners received newspapers carefully edited to emphasize Allied defeats and German victories. Camp libraries were stocked with literature designed to undermine confidence in American war aims. Lectures were organized, ostensibly for education, but with content that questioned why Americans were fighting a war that was none of their concern. Some propaganda targeted specific groups. African American soldiers received leaflets reminding them of racial injustice at home, asking why they should fight for a country that denied them basic rights. The approach was cynical but not entirely ineffective. The genuine grievances of Black Americans provided fertile ground for German messaging. At Rastatt, where Halyburton arrived after his transfer from Tuchel, the propaganda campaign was particularly intense. The camp held approximately 500 American prisoners by early 1918, enough to constitute a significant target for psychological operations. Halyburton recognized the threat immediately. He had watched men at Tuchel succumb to despair, had seen how hunger and isolation could make German promises of better treatment seem almost reasonable. He understood that maintaining prisoner morale was as important as maintaining physical health. His fellow Americans elected him camp commander. It was an unofficial position, unrecognized in German regulations, but the camp authorities permitted it. Having a single leader to deal with simplified administration, they did not anticipate what Halyburton would do with the role. He established what he called a firm camp structure. Every American prisoner was assigned a job, some duty that gave purpose to days that might otherwise dissolve into despair. Work details were organized. Education programs were created. A camp newspaper was started. Most importantly, Halyburton handpicked an intelligence staff. Their mission was to monitor the effectiveness of German propaganda on American prisoners. They watched for men who seemed susceptible to German messaging. They identified potential collaborators. They worked to counter German narratives with information of their own, news from home that filtered through despite censorship, reminders of why they were fighting and what awaited them when victory came. The Germans eventually recognized Halyburton as the official leader of American prisoners at Rastatt. It was a bureaucratic convenience that also represented a German defeat. By acknowledging his authority, they had legitimized an organization dedicated to resisting their influence. For his leadership at Rastatt, Halyburton would later receive the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the first enlisted men to be so honored. The citation spoke of his extraordinary service in maintaining order and morale among American prisoners. It did not fully capture the scope of his achievement. In a place designed to break men, he had built something that could not be broken. Not every American was content to wait out the war behind German wire. From the earliest captures, men began planning escapes. The statistics are remarkable. Of the approximately 4,120 Americans held by Germany, 113 successfully escaped and reached Allied or neutral territory. This represented an escape rate far higher than most other nationalities, a testament perhaps to American individualism, perhaps to the shorter duration of American captivity, perhaps simply to the desperate courage of men who refused to accept imprisonment. The first successful escape came from an unlikely source. Charles Willett Smith of Norwalk, Connecticut, was not a soldier but a merchant mariner, captured when his ship fell prey to a German raider. On October 10, 1917, Smith crossed into neutral Sweden, becoming the first American to successfully flee a permanent German prison camp. He was followed a month later by Patrick O'Brien of Momence, Illinois, who had enlisted with the Royal Flying Corps. O'Brien's escape demonstrated a pattern that would repeat throughout the war. American aviators, captured when their aircraft were shot down, proved particularly determined escapers. Perhaps the independence required to fly alone above the battlefield translated into the self-reliance needed to flee across hostile territory. Once American ground troops began arriving in large numbers, the escapes multiplied. The close-in trench fighting created opportunities that did not exist in other contexts. Some men were captured but managed to slip away before being removed from the battle zone, crossing no man's land to friendly lines before the Germans could secure them. The first American soldier to successfully escape from a permanent prison camp was Private Frank Sowicki of Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. On October 9, 1918, with the war entering its final weeks, Sowicki crossed into Switzerland. He had walked through German territory, avoiding patrols, scrounging food, navigating by stars and intuition, until he reached the neutral border. But the most famous American escape belonged to Navy Lieutenant Edouard Victor Michael Isaacs. Isaacs' story began on May 31, 1918. When the USS President Lincoln, a troop transport, was torpedoed by the German submarine U-90. The ship sank in under 30 minutes. Most of the crew escaped, but Isaacs found himself pulled aboard the submarine, the lone American prisoner on a vessel that would spend weeks at sea before returning to Germany. For any other man, the situation might have seemed hopeless. For Isaacs, it was an opportunity. During his weeks aboard U-90, Isaacs watched everything. He memorized the submarine's design, its operating procedures, its capabilities and limitations. He noted the routes the vessel traveled, the rendezvous points where it met other U-boats or supply ships. He filed away every detail that might prove valuable to Allied intelligence. He also began planning his escape. His first attempt came while the submarine passed between Denmark and Sweden. Isaacs tried to slip overboard and swim to neutral waters. He was caught. The Germans did not execute him, though they might have been justified under the circumstances. Instead, they delivered him to the prison camp system. At Karlsruhe, he tried again, caught again. The Germans transferred him to Villingen, a camp in the Black Forest region that was considered more secure. During the transfer, Isaacs hurled himself through the window of a moving train. He was badly injured in the fall. German guards recaptured him within minutes. They beat him savagely, rifle butts cracking against his skull and back, kicks finding his ribs as he lay on the ground. 7 or 8 times they knocked him down, and 7 or 8 times they struck him as he tried to rise. He spent 3 weeks in solitary confinement, nursing wounds that would have broken most men's will to resist. It did not break Isaacs. At Villingen, he slowly recovered his strength while continuing to plan. The camp held about 150 Russian officers and 75 Americans. The Russians were not guarded closely, considered friends by the Germans due to the separate peace Russia had signed. The guards focused their attention on the Americans. By October 1918, Isaacs was ready for one final attempt. He had organized a group of 11 other prisoners for a coordinated escape on the night of October 6th. The plan was complex, requiring precise timing and considerable luck. When the moment came, Isaacs did something extraordinary. He deliberately drew the guards' attention, exposing himself to machine gun fire so that his companions might have a better chance. It was the act of a man who had calculated the odds and decided that some things mattered more than survival. Of the 13 men who attempted the escape that night, only 3 succeeded in crossing into Switzerland. Isaacs was one of them. He reached neutral territory on October 13, 1918, less than a month before the war ended. He immediately reported his intelligence to British and American naval officers. The information he had gathered aboard U-90, preserved through months of captivity and multiple escape attempts, was delivered at last. For his actions, Edouard Isaacs received the Medal of Honor. He later changed his name to Isaac, served 10 terms in the United States Congress, and became part of a fact-finding delegation that inspected Nazi concentration camps after World War II. He died in 1990 at the age of 98, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the First World War. His story encompassed everything the American prisoner experience represented: the courage, the resistance, the refusal to accept defeat. The Armistice of November 11, 1918, contained a clause that American prisoners had been dreaming of for months. Article 10 demanded the immediate repatriation without reciprocity of all Allied and United States prisoners of war. Without reciprocity, the words mattered. Germany's prisoners in Allied hands would wait. America's prisoners in German hands would go home. The machinery of release moved with surprising speed. The German government, collapsing into revolution and chaos, had little appetite for holding on to foreign prisoners. The men who had been America's enemies were now desperate to see American captives leave. The route home passed through Switzerland. Trains carried prisoners south from the German camps, across the border into neutral territory, where the Red Cross and American authorities waited to receive them. On December 7, 1918, the first trainload of released American privates arrived in Basel. Among them was a group from Rastatt, including members of the prison camp band that Clyde Grimsley had organized. They played music as they crossed into freedom. Grimsley himself was released that December and returned home 3 months later, arriving in the United States on February 19, 1919. He went back to Kansas, married his fiancée Mary Crandall, and lived quietly until his death in 1967. He is buried in Fort Logan National Cemetery. Halyburton's homecoming was different. His leadership at Rastatt had marked him for greater recognition. The army promoted him, acknowledging the extraordinary service he had rendered behind enemy wire. He remained in uniform, pursuing a military career that spanned decades. In 1932, Halyburton published his memoir, titling it Shoot and Be Damned. The book recounted his experiences at Tuchel and Rastatt, the hunger and the cold, the propaganda battles and the small victories of resistance. It was not a bestseller. The American public in 1932 was more concerned with economic collapse than with memories of a war that already seemed ancient. But for those who had shared his experience, the book served as testament. Halyburton died in 1945 and is interred at Los Angeles National Cemetery. His grave marker makes no mention of the months he spent in German captivity, the men whose lives he saved through organization and leadership, the resistance he mounted against an enemy who wanted his soul as well as his body. The homecoming was incomplete for all of them. They returned to a nation that did not quite understand what they had endured. The physical toll was evident. The gaunt faces and weakened frames of men who had survived on starvation rations. The psychological wounds were less visible, but no less real. There was no formal recognition program for former prisoners of war, no systematic effort to document their experiences or address their trauma. They were expected to resume normal lives, to put the war behind them, to become again the men they had been before capture. Most of them managed after a fashion. They married, raised families, pursued careers. They told stories at family gatherings. Sometimes they woke from nightmares they never explained. And gradually, they were forgotten. The American prisoner of war experience in the First World War has largely vanished from national memory. There are reasons for this erasure, some understandable, some less so. The numbers were small compared to what came later. 4,000 Americans held by Germany seems almost trivial when measured against the hundreds of thousands captured in World War II, in Korea, in Vietnam. The duration was brief, months rather than years. There was no Bataan death march, no Hanoi Hilton, no imagery searing enough to demand permanent remembrance. But the forgetting represents a loss beyond statistics. These men were the test cases. They established precedents that would shape international law for generations. The Red Cross food parcel system, refined through the experience of feeding American prisoners in German camps, would become the lifeline that sustained millions in the next World War. The principle of neutral inspections, championed by Ambassador Gerard and implemented through Swiss intermediaries, would form the foundation of the Geneva Conventions. The resistance they mounted, the organizations they built behind the wire, the escapes they attempted and sometimes achieved, all of this entered the institutional memory of the American military. When the next war came, when American prisoners again faced systematic attempts to break their will, they drew on lessons learned in places like Tuchel and Rastatt and Villingen. Colonel Greg Eanes, a retired Air Force officer and expert on prisoner of war issues, published the first comprehensive survey of the American experience in 2018. He titled it, "Captured, Not Conquered." The phrase captures something essential about these forgotten men. They were captured. That was beyond their control. The fortunes of war delivered them into enemy hands, stripped them of weapons and freedom, reduced them to numbers in a German bureaucratic system. But they were not conquered. In the camps, they maintained their identity as Americans. They resisted propaganda. They organized themselves. They escaped when they could and endured when they could not. They came home, most of them, unbowed. There is a tendency in American culture to celebrate only victories, to remember only the moments of triumph. The prisoner of war experience fits uneasily into this framework. These were men who did not win their battles. They were taken, they were held, they suffered. But there is another kind of victory, harder to see and perhaps more important to understand. It is the victory of maintaining humanity in inhuman circumstances, of refusing to become what your captors want you to become, of keeping faith with yourself and your nation, when every external support has been stripped away. The 4,000 Americans who passed through German prison camps in the First World War achieved this victory. They did not break. They did not bend. They came home carrying stories that Germany did not want told, stories of courage and resistance and survival. For a century, those stories have remained largely untold. The men who lived them are gone now, the last of them passing decades ago, but their experience remains, waiting to be remembered. On November 2nd, 1917, Sergeant Edgar Halyburton stood before a German camera, his hand in his pocket, his fist clenched, his eyes burning with defiance. He could not know what awaited him. He could not know that the photograph would outlast the empire that captured him. He could not know that more than a century later someone would tell his story. But perhaps in some way he was already telling it. Perhaps that defiant gaze was a message sent across time, waiting for someone to receive it. We have received it now.